Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we're going to take a look at the full moon that's coming up by the end of the week. It's early in the morning on Friday morning, the 19th, and we will want to be looking at that we're going to be looking at that full moon in the context of the new moon that preceded it. Because, it's important to recognize we're not just looking at a random snapshot when we do these charts. We are, in fact, looking at a cycle of events, and the full moon is part of a cycle that begins with the new moon. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of that. I'm sure most people that dabble in astrology are aware of that factor, that there's a new moon cycle and there's a full moon moment in that cycle. But I think it's really important to pay attention to all of the stations in the cycle, especially we can look at the quarter moon as well, as being a part of the cycle that began on April 5th. So it's just another way to look at that chart and to think about what we're up to and what's going on with our lives, and tune into the cosmic perspective that accompanies everything that we do when we take the time to look into it. So that's what I want to think about when we come into this full moon. And so let's go ahead and look at the chart. So here we have the chart itself for the full moon. And one thing we'll want to be paying attention to is the 29-degree mark. Lately the full moon has been moving backward through the zodiac to the point where it's no longer in the next sign, which it used to be, that the sun was in the next sign from where the new moon started. So the new moon that began this cycle started at the 15-degree mark of the 15-degree mark of Aries, and now we're at the 29-degree mark. So it's come about 14 days, which makes sense because it's a 14-day cycle from the new moon to the full. If you'll remember, at that time, we were very focused on the fact that Mercury was very close to Neptune, so there was a lot of Neptune in the cycle. We were very focused on the fact that Saturn and Pluto were very strongly connected to each other. And that has been something that came out even more so in the quarter moon that followed the new moon, because that quarter moon took place at 22 degrees of Cancer, if you'll recall. I'm not going to bring up that chart, but just to mention that it was very interesting the way the previous quarter moon aligned with the North Node at 22 degrees also of Cancer. As you can see now, the North Node is at 21. It's moved backwards a little bit. But it's still right in between, the nodal axis is still right in between Saturn and Pluto. And I think that's a very significant thing. And it's also good to remember that the rest of the cycle has been activating that same point. So we have Saturn and Pluto again. I can show you the parallels in the time passages software. You can right-click on a planet. The parallels do not show in a circular flat map like we see the chart, but instead they are in the opposite direction of the XY coordinate, which is they are above and below the celestial equator. So the parallels do show, but you'd have to imagine the planets being slightly elevated above the chart paper or below the chart that we see in a two-dimensional array like this on our screen. That's the chart itself represented on a piece of paper, basically. But if we right-click, we can see what that degree would be, and the declination of Saturn is at 21.27, which is 21.5, almost exactly 21.5 degrees. And then if we look at Pluto, it's going to be very similar. It's 21.7. So 0.2 of a degree separate them. There's a parallel with Pluto also, but that's at 22 degrees, so that's about a degree off, which is still counts. And especially the fact that did I say Pluto? Jupiter has just stationed, so Jupiter is standing still in the sky and about a degree away from Pluto as far as declination goes, and actually also is in a semi-sextile, being at 24 degrees, and Pluto is at 23 degrees, and also Eris is at 23 degrees. So these are in a partile square, Pluto and Eris. And you know that Eris, this new planet beyond Pluto that's just been recognized, it's actually sort of more dynamic than Pluto in the Kuiper Belt. And I've been able to show that it is very powerful in charts, and a lot of astrologers are tuning into that now. In the Mountain Astrologer magazine, they're using it in the new moon and full moon charts now, also Eris. Because Eris and Pluto really are celestial twins. They're not that different in the astronomical characteristics. They both are in the Kuiper Belt, about the same size. Each one has a couple of satellites. They're the two largest objects that have been so far discovered in the Kuiper Belt, and probably are the two largest objects, period, in the Kuiper Belt. So, it stands to reason that in the astrology that Pluto and Eris would both be significant in charts, and that's what seems to be the case. It seems to be the case that in natal charts, when Eris contacts any natal planet in the natal chart, it really brings that planet into prominence in the person's life. And it has to do with soul intention, because it's depth. It goes to depth. Both Eris and Pluto go to depth. So it's interesting to see these two in square, and it really brings the Pluto out. So what we have now, and for the entire cycle, is we have Pluto and Saturn in very close connection to each other, only a few degrees apart. In declination, even closer, a quarter of a degree in declination is almost nothing. So this is a very strong time of Saturn-Pluto. And the interesting thing about that also, well, maybe the first thing to mention is personally, in our own lives. So when we have Saturn and Pluto, and it would depend a little bit on how the Saturn and Pluto in your own chart are configured. Any time you're having a transit from an outer planet like Saturn or like Pluto, you want to look at that, the placement of that planet in your natal chart, and see how that really lines up for you. Or also consider where the 23 to the 20 degree mark of a cardinal sign would be activated. If you have the sun in that particular placement, if you have any planet, for Venus, or a personal planet, or not so much the outer planets, but Jupiter, for example, you would definitely feel that there was a significant transformation occurring. And this is so important to recognize. We don't always see the big picture when we're going through, So I like to point that out, that if you are in the midst of the Saturn-Pluto, we all are in the midst of the Saturn-Pluto, triggered by Eris, also part of the Uranus-Pluto square that is still active within 10 degrees at this moment, because Uranus is still in the very early degrees of Taurus. So right through till 2020, we consider this to be the timing of the activation of this Pluto-Uranus square, which is a transformational aspect. In other words, when they were conjunct in the 60s, the whole culture was going through a revolution. A lot of new ideas came in. And now this timing in the 20-teens is to see the viability of that revolution, just as the quarter moon is to see how that new moon cycle is going to unfold. This is a longer cycle. It's a cycle with Pluto and Uranus, and the question becomes, will those notions of a new dawn, a new way to be in the culture, in the world, to have peace, love, and harmony, for example, the characteristics of the hippie revolution, to see if those are viable in the mainstream culture. They were not really part of the mainstream culture at the time. There was a certain amount of reaction to it. You could call it, kind of a pushback, or reaction that stirred people up and made them definitely feel like kind of a backlash. It wasn't really viable in the culture at that time. And then, of course, we had the Reagan years following that. But now we're coming back to a place where we want to ask that question. And certainly we're seeing a lot of people espousing some of these ideas about diversity in the population, about where the culture is going, what can we do to make things better for people, what can we do about this income inequality, which is more of a, you could say it's a conservative approach that, let the people that have the money and the power, let them stay in power, and they're going to keep things regulated, and things are going to be not so experimental and wild. And then there's people coming along from the left saying, let's be experimental and wild. So that's a bit of a polarity that's in our times. And you can see that also in the Saturn empowerment and in the Uranus empowerment that we see routinely. We were seeing Uranus with Eris, and that's still viable. It's still less than 10 degrees apart. And that is going to be true also through 2020. So it's interesting to see that Uranus is empowered in this cycle, and that Saturn is empowered with the connection to Pluto, and that we have that that represents the polarity between conservative and progressive notions. And we have this acting out in our own lives as well. You know, we have the questions of whether to stay in our safe path, you know, you could call it a rut perhaps, or do we branch out? Do we move ahead, forward? And there's a lot of energy for that right now. With Eris especially triggered in this whole situation. Eris is a feminine warrior energy for what deeply motivates you. To be able to stand up and to make a statement about it, to be able to act upon what you deeply believe and not fail to act upon what you most deeply believe, whichever that might be. However you feel about current politics, however you feel about your life, how your job is working out, how your relationships are working out. Having the courage to stay the course is one thing, of course, with Saturn being, you know, let's be conservative, let's not jump ahead, let's take things slow and carefully and just, you know, not go too fast. And then you have the Uranus concept of we need to break out, we need to make a change. Uranus was called freedom from the known. I love that characterization of Uranus from Jeff Green's work. He wrote a book called, before he wrote the Pluto book that he's famous for, he wrote a book about Uranus called Freedom from the Known, which I think is marvelous. Anyway, so that's the basic fundamental factor in this full moon that wasn't so much of a factor. When I say that's the basic factor, I mean the Saturn-Uranus empowerment with the Sun being very close to Uranus in this full moon chart. So we know that Uranus is special right now, or coming up right now. I shouldn't say right now because we're in the early part of the week as we speak here. But by the time Friday comes around, we should be seeing a bit of more of an impulse for change, and that reflects the current polarization in our society as well, where we see what Rick Tarnas called with the Saturn-Pluto that he described in his book Cosmos and Psyche, the world transit, he called it, of Saturn and Pluto, that this is a time of great stress and conservative empowerment, that, you know, we have a lot of Saturn, and that Saturn is telling us, you know, hold back, don't do anything too radical. And at the same time with Pluto there, we have the structural changes that are indicated by, you know, major events that take place that are, you know, bending our consciousness and bending our understanding of what's really going on in our lives as well. And in this full moon, it's important to recognize that we now have, by the time Friday rolls around, not so much today, we have Mercury crossed into Aries. I think it crosses tomorrow, which is Wednesday. And then by Friday it will be at 2 degrees and therefore very close to the degree of Chiron. So we want to think about that too, that there's a painful reality that we're becoming more aware of. The consciousness is there to understand our own inner wounding and to understand how we can make a difference with that, because consciousness makes a huge difference to the way we act on an internal basis, which is what Chiron really represents as the wounded healer. And this is interesting to me also, that these two planets, Mercury and Chiron is kind of a planetoid really, are opposite one of these new bodies, which are considered planets, I believe. They're called dwarf type of planets, which is Haumea. So this is Haumea. I'm sorry, this is Makemake. Haumea is up here. But these two Earth energy planets are very similar in the way they behave. They're both really connected with profound connection with nature. I think that this is Makemake. I think that Makemake is the more activist of the two. And this is the symbol for Haumea that I've created. These symbols are becoming accepted now. A lot of people at the previous United Astrology Congress conference that I attended, I did a little petition to see how many people would be okay with these as planetary glyphs, and I got pretty much universal acceptance. Yes, these are nice glyphs. They look sort of like Pluto, but not, a little different than Pluto, but these are very similar to Pluto in the period of their orbit. They transit their period is about over 248 years, which is Pluto. One is Haumea, which is 298 years, and then Makemake is 309 years. So pretty similar. They move very slowly in charts, and I'm bringing them up now because they are active in this configuration. It turns out that opposite to where Eris is located, 23 of Aries, we do have Haumea at 25, and that's activated also by the station of Jupiter, a sextile away, stationing at 24 degrees. So they're very active right now. And then, of course, you have the Pluto, you have a T-square with the opposition between Eris and Haumea is also conditioned by this. It makes it T-square to Pluto. So this is a very strong time for these environmental factors. Love of the earth, the beauty of the earthly environment, the threat to the earthly environment that we are aware of more and more with global warming, which is becoming a big issue on the national scene, as you know. I mean, there's all this talk about a Green New Deal with the progressive Democrats coming in. There's the resistance to that we see as well, and you can think about Saturn and that don't do anything strange, don't try to get away from fossil fuels. That's how we run the world, that's how we heat our homes, you know. But of course, there is the alternative energy movement. So these things are very interesting to see both Makemake and Haumea activated in this chart. Makes me think that it's kind of a factor for the nation as a whole right now. So I think that's all I wanted to say about this full moon, that it continues the notion of transformation that's very much part of this whole April cycle. We are in the midst of big changes, each one of us. And then now it brings Uranus in, which wasn't so much a factor before, and also brings Chiron more to the fore with Mercury and Chiron, so that we're more aware of perhaps what could be the impediments to our own growth in terms of the fear and the pain that we find in ourselves, that we are conditioned by early childhood. That's the hallmark of this Chiron factor, that it does get back to early wounding. And there's a terrific resource about that, which is Melanie Reinhardt's book, which is Chiron and the Healing Journey, if you're interested in discovering more about that. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. And then I do have something a little special today to also talk about, which is in the nature of the research that can be done with charts and with mundane astrology. And for that, I'm going to bring up a chart for France. So this is the chart which is normally celebrated for the French Revolution, which is July 14th, which is Bastille Day. 1789 was the year that the Bastille came down, and it's still celebrated as the birthday of France. As you know, it's a big holiday in France. And of course, what's happening in France right now is the horrible news about the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which is also somewhat good news that they are going to be able to recover most of the building. It will be rebuilt, so that's great. But the horrible sight of Notre Dame burning, which cuts to the quick of every French person, made me think to look at this chart and see what that might tell us, because we know that it's a big event in France. We know that this is a huge national event. Every French person is involved in recognizing how iconic this building, the structure is, going back hundreds and hundreds of years, of course, to the probably 600s, I think, was the origin of the cathedral. Well, this chart, similar to the chart in the United States, which has the sun in Cancer, which is July birthday also, this chart has the sun at 22 degrees of Cancer. And that might be ringing a bell because we know that's where the nodal axis is pointing right now. We know as well that there was this huge quarter moon on the nodal axis a few days ago and Friday. And then today, if we look at the transits for the timing of the event, which was 7 p.m., you can see here, 7 p.m. in local time. So we'd want to look and see where everything was lining up. And it is quite fascinating that the Saturn and the Pluto at 20 and 23 are lined up right across the zodiac from this 22-degree sun. And there's even an extra piece of that, which is if we look at the declination of this sun, we see that it's in that same exact time framework on a positive rather than a negative direction, so it's a contraparallel. So Saturn contraparallel with the sun, you see. So there's the sun in the French national chart, 21.6, and remember the minus of Pluto is 21.7, and the minus declination of Saturn is 21.5. So, I mean, this is just like a perfect storm. You know, you can see it in the astrology of these three, the natal sun in there in the chart of the French Republic, the first time it was a republic, and then Saturn and Pluto indicating, wow, the destruction of a huge structure that represents that sense of self with France, and a transformation. So France is going through a transformation right now, as we can see from also the public demonstrations that have been in the streets. I don't know that much about French politics or French current events, but certainly it's very interesting to see this lineup, along with the nodal axis. You see, the nodal axis being just very close to the same 22-degree mark. The Mercury in the French chart being at 23 degrees, and of course at 23 degrees exactly we also have Eris making a part of that whole T-square, and we have the Sun also was coming across that same point a few days before was the perfection of that. But it really does speak to the idea that this is a very powerful time for this French population, and that they feel their institutions are changing and things have to be looked at in a whole new way. So it's interesting what you can do with mundane astrology, with the charts of nations. I got this chart from thinking about the French situation, and also from, there's a book called The Astrology of World Horoscopes by Nick Campion. And he talks about this chart, but he also talks about, there's the chart from 1958, which was the most recent republic, the Fifth Republic, and there's the chart from also 1792, which is the result of the French Revolution that this was the beginning of, and that is the chart for the First Republic. But neither of those two charts had the same qualities as this one, with this 22-degree sun, which is so strongly affected. So to me, it makes sense that you think about this as the real chart, the real sense of where the French feel that their national origin comes from is from that revolution, the 1789 revolution, which overthrew the monarchy, of course. So it's very interesting to me to see this chart be so dramatic, which is actually, of course, the chart that they celebrate, the day that they celebrate in Bastille Day, which is July 14th every year. And of course, also in this chart, just to recognize as well, the Chiron in this chart is at 24 degrees of Gemini, exactly opposite the station of this Jupiter, which was a few days ago. So at 24 degrees, this Chiron is also part of this whole configuration being very strongly activated, which is the painful sense and the national sense, you know, the sense of the public, that things are in kind of a tough place with their country right now. And there's one more thing that we should be looking at here. Let's save this, which is let's think about how the USA chart is being affected also by this full moon. It's on the same theme because this is the mundane chart for the United States. We know that this chart is a good chart for the United States. It's the Sibley chart with a variation by Dane Rudjar, and the fact that the 9/11 happened right across this ascendant descendant. I think this is a very good chart for the U.S. And what we see, it's also interesting, I think, right now, is that Maki transiting wise is at the top of this U.S. chart, as well as Haumea being in Libra also. They are just about, their midpoint is somewhere close to 14 degrees, which is Saturn. I don't know the exact midpoint, although I can find out, but I won't do that. Well, I guess I could. Okay, so let's go to the full moon chart, and we can look at where that midpoint is by looking at the midpoint report that tells everything. And we should be able to find those two planets, even though they're kind of way down on the planet list, aren't they? But, see, I haven't done this before, but I think I can do it. 15. Okay, so 15 Libra, that's a quarter of a degree different from the Saturn in the US chart. So, this is, to me, quite interesting to think about these environmental planets, these planets representing love of nature, these new planets, but that seems to be the lineup. I've been doing a lot of research, an article coming out in Mountain Astrology pretty soon about it, that they do represent a profound connection to nature, and an activist way, and just a love of nature, and a complete surrender to nature, a spiritual path. And the charts of many people that I've looked at that have to do, their lives having to do with these issues, with environmental issues. And the fact that they're so strong in the United States chart right now, with the midpoint on the Saturn in the US chart, and activated now as well because of the opposition between Sun and, this happens to be the transits for today that I did, but, if we did the transits for the full moon, the Sun is a little bit further along at 29 degrees. But still, there's this opposition between Eris and the Sun to Haumea in the sky, and it's in the 10th house. And what is this aspect, just to look? Quintile with the natal Eris in the US chart. I hadn't noticed that, so that's another factor that it's connecting to the Eris in the US chart, which would be the will of the nation to take action and to do something that corresponds to their values. So I just think that the environmental issues that's represented by the Democrats, some of the new freshman Democrats particularly, pushing for what they're calling a Green New Deal, which is to spend government money on getting carbon out of the atmosphere, perhaps reducing the impact of global warming. We apparently have 10 or 12 years to do that, and making a lot of jobs happen. So it's got a lot of support, and it's kind of a vital thing right now is to look at what's happening with the environment, because it is significant. This 24-degree mark is also prominent in the U.S. chart, 24 degrees of Cancer, which is where the Mercury in the U.S. chart aligns, and it again is connected to where Jupiter is stationing at 24 degrees. So there's a lot of messages coming out, a lot of information coming out, and a recognition that things have to change in this regard, I believe. So I think that's a good message to bring forward in any case. It is something that I believe is important to talk about, that we have to do something about global warming. And with Mercury activated in this chart, maybe it's a good time to be talking about these things. Makemake being opposed as well to the Mercury, and the Chiron, which is to discuss a painful situation with the environment. So I'll leave you with that notion that it is time to kind of concentrate on that issue, and that a lot of people in this country are beginning to get on that bandwagon, and that we also have the polarity that goes on right now between innovative and conservative viewpoints. And that polarity is getting even more exacerbated as evidenced by these cycles, by this whole April cycle. So it's interesting to recognize that, I believe, too. So best of luck. Let me switch back to the other view, and just want to say best of luck with all that. And these are powerful times we're living through. May you live in interesting times, the Chinese proverb, certainly true of these days. And we want to mention also that we're trying to make astrology available to people in every way we can, and these newsletters we send out, and the software that we've created. I think the basic edition is on sale this month, to make it easy to get into, to start to explore these things with your own chart, and have some other perspective on what's going on with you and what's going on with the lives of all of us right now. So that's it. Have a good couple of weeks, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.